This is the WGBH Forum Network.
Let me add my welcome to all of you for the Cambridge Forum tonight. Tim just read the title of the book, The Exception to the Rulers. There is also a provocative subtitle, Exposing Oily Politicians, War Profiteers, and the Media That Love Them. The book, by Amy Goodman and her brother David, explores the role of corporate-owned media and the risks that they pose to a democratic society. Our guests tonight are the book's authors and MIT professor Noam Chomsky. Speaking first will be David Goodman. He's an award-winning independent journalist. He's the author of 5 books, including the critically acclaimed Fault Lines, Journeys into the New South Africa. Mr. Goodman is a contributing writer for Mother Jones. His articles have appeared in The Nation, The Washington Post, The Washington Quarterly, The Christian Science Monitor, The Boston Globe, Outside, and The Village Voice, among others. Welcome to the Cambridge Forum, David Goodman.
Thanks, and it's great to be here. I want to dispel any rumors that Amy and I wrote this book just so we could be sure to get a seat at a Noam Chomsky talk in Cambridge. But it sure helps, and it is really a particular honor to be up here with somebody who both of us have really admired and looked up to. And when I went to school here at that place across the street 20 years ago, I like to think I didn't miss too many of your talks wedged into whatever room that was overflowing and over at MIT or around here. This is a stop we've really looked forward to, but it's also part of a 70-city tour we are doing for The Exception to the Rulers. And the tour is a celebration of several things. One is of independent media all around the country, and we've going from California to Maine. Often the events are fundraisers for local community radio and TV stations. It's a celebration of independent bookstores like the Harvard Bookstore, endangered species in this age of the corporatization of everything, especially the bookstores, and also a celebration of the work that so many of you do in your own communities just to make a difference. I'm going to read a little bit from The Exception of the Rulers to give you an idea of what we do here. I like to think that a lot of what we're doing here are telling you the stories you should have read or heard in the corporate media, but didn't. And it really should not be necessary for a couple of journalists to write a book called The Exception to the Rulers. That ought to be the motto of all media. But unfortunately, as we saw, particularly in the war on Iraq, the media served as a megaphone to the rulers. One of the things we look at was the whole embedding process, embedding reporters with the military, which really, I think, represented a low point in the history of journalism in this country. Interestingly, we just came from talking to journalists over at the Nieman Foundation, and privately, off the record, in intimate conversation, so many of those journalists agreed with us. Unfortunately, you're not seeing this where it counts, which is in the moment. So we tell you in our chapter on this, it's called In Bed with the Military, and we give you a little of the pillow talk that the in-beds were sharing with each other, but not with you. We have, for example, from Gordon Dillow, columnist for the Orange County Register, who was embedded with the Marines. He said, quote, "The Baghdad fight was a close enough thing that at one point a Marine gave me a hand grenade to throw if the enemy started to overwhelm us. It had been more than 30 years since I'd held a grenade. I'd been an Army sergeant in Vietnam. And I knew that my having it violated written and unwritten rules. Still, it felt comforting in my hand." From Rick Leventhal, embedded correspondent with the Marines, he worked for Fox News. Quote, "It was difficult. We were dressing like them, and we were eating and sleeping with them. We became a part of them." And lastly, from Chantal Escoto, reporting for the Leaf Chronicle, embedded with the Marines, quote, "I was a non-combatant, but I told them I'd be willing to pick up a gun if I had to. They're pretty easy to use. It's point and shoot." Well, one of the nice things you get to do when you write a book is you don't have to turn to the know-nothing pundits for an analysis of what's going on in the news. You can turn to people who you really think got it right the first time around. We chose Groucho Marx. In our chapter called Sanitize, which pretty much sums up what we thought of the imagery of war that was coming back, we let Groucho kick it off with his quote, "I must say I find television very educational. The minute somebody turns it on, I go to the library and read a book." Another part of the hidden news is the war at home, and that war has been waged against people in the immigrant communities and against political dissidents and dissent in general. Some of the people that are really on the sharp end of the stick have been people from immigrant communities all around this country. In December 2002, Amy attended the meeting of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. Now, that was a particularly meaningful time because more than 1,500 Muslims were there. It was December 21st, the day after the second special registration of immigrants in the United States. The special registration was originally going to cover just 5 countries, but each month the INS added another set to the list. Between November 2002 and April 2003, all male non-citizens over the age of 16 from 25 different countries, almost all of them predominantly Muslim or Arab nations, were required to register and be interviewed by the INS. And incidentally, the upshot of all that was as follows. Of the 83,519 males from 25 countries who voluntarily registered, nearly 1 in 6 were placed in deportation proceedings. The government said that 2,870 people were detained during this time, and of these, 11 individuals had, quote, suspected terrorist ties, although a Homeland Security Department spokesman had no information on their cases. We spoke to, one of the people who spoke at that meeting was an Iranian-American attorney who described her exasperation and horror at the process as people were rounded up. So many people were arrested at the special registration in LA, they ran out of plastic handcuffs. She exclaimed at this conference, "What happened to the Sixth Amendment? What happened to due process?" And she continued, "It's not a Muslim thing, it's not an Iranian thing, it's not an Arab thing, it's a human thing. Today it's men over the age of 16 from these countries. Tomorrow it'll be women over the age of 16. Then we'll go to permanent residence. It's a wake-up call." Well, as we learned as we researched the book, the wake-up call has already been delivered on our doorstep, and that is to people who have dared to dissent during this time of war. There were so many little, mundane, day-to-day stories, we just included what we called a crackdown sampler. Here's a few. Protester with sign charged with threatening the president's safety. Brett Bursey, the executive director of the South Carolina Progressive Network, was arrested for holding a sign that read, quote, "No war for oil," outside a venue where President Bush was giving a speech in October 2002. He was charged with threatening the president's safety. Bursey, who was nowhere near the president, said the police told him he should move to a free speech zone. He refused. He refused, saying, quote, "I thought the whole country was a free speech zone." Busted for a peace T-shirt. On March 3rd, 2003, a father and son went shopping at a mall outside of Albany, New York. The two had bought T-shirts at the mall and promptly put them on. Stephen Downs' shirt read, quote, "Give peace a chance," and "Peace on Earth." His son Roger had a shirt that read, "Let inspections work," and "No war with Iraq." A mall security guard requested that both men take off the T-shirts. When Stephen Downs refused, the mall called the police. Soon, Downs, a retired attorney with the New York State Commission on Judicial Conduct, was in handcuffs, arrested on trespassing charges. 2 days later, 150 supporters wearing peace T-shirts descended on the mall, forcing them to drop the charges. Anti-war actor banned. Following actor Danny Glover's public criticism in November 2001 of the use of military tribunals, the Modesto, California City Council attempted to disinvite Glover as the featured speaker for the official celebration of Martin Luther King Day 2002. Glover wondered if King, who called the United States, quote, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, would have been invited to his own birthday party if he were still alive. A week ago, we were being interviewed by a reporter who asked us, who responded to things he read in the book by saying, isn't this just a little bit much, a little extreme? You make it out to be like we're like some repressive country out there that's... Again, a nice thing when you write a book is you don't have to answer those questions. You can turn to people who are much smarter and more experienced in these matters. So we chose Chilean author Ariel Dorfman, who narrowly escaped death on September 11, 1973, when a last-minute change kept him from his work at the Presidential Palace in Santiago, where he was cultural advisor to Chilean President Salvador Allende. Allende died that day when Chilean troops stormed the palace in a U.S.-backed coup, and Dorfman was forced into exile. On the second anniversary of the September 11th attacks in the U.S., he wrote an essay, Lessons of a Catastrophe. Here's a little excerpt. It can't happen here. 30 years ago, that is what we chanted. That is what we sang on the streets of Santiago de Chile. It can't happen here. There can never be a dictatorship in this country, we proclaimed to the winds of history that were about to furiously descend on us. Our democracy is too solid, our armed forces too committed to popular sovereignty, our people too much in love with freedom. But it did happen. The bombing by the Air Force of the Presidential Palace on September 11, 1973, started a dictatorship that was to last 17 years and that today, even after we have recovered democracy, continues to haunt and corrode my country. In the coming years, could something similar befall those nations with apparently stable democracies? Could the erosion of freedom that so many in Chile accepted as necessary find a perverse recurrence in the United States, or India, or Brazil, in France, or Spain, or Britain? What has transpired thus far in the 2 years since the disastrous attacks on New York and Washington is far from encouraging. We also thought, we also shouted, we also assured the planet, it cannot happen here. We also thought, on those not-so-remote streets of Santiago, that we could shut our eyes to the terrors that were awaiting us tomorrow. Before turning this over to Amy and Noam, I thought it's only fitting that I reveal there is, in fact, a connection between the people on this stage. And we have my mother, Dory Goodman, brother Dan Goodman, are here tonight. It's a special treat for us, and we've been having a debate raging all day as to the actual history with Noam Chomsky, but I can give you the beginnings of it, and Noam may have to defend himself later, but our late father, George Goodman, and Noam were camp counselors together at a Hebrew-speaking camp in Pennsylvania, I think it was, and I guess the only rule was you couldn't speak English all day, which may explain something about the career that Noam chose for the rest of his life about studying this. But the piece that we're going to need clarification on is, now Amy insists this is true, my mother denies it. Amy says that at one point you got into something with my father and you bit him. So... any pretense of being, peaceful, nonviolent defenders here, we're going to have to settle this score once and for all tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David Goodman. You're listening to the Cambridge Forum, discussing the role of the media in democracy. Our next speaker is Amy Goodman. In The Exception to the Rulers, She writes that the responsibility of a journalist is, and I quote, going where the silence is, giving a voice to those who've been forgotten, forsaken, and beaten down by the powerful. She suggests that the media today have largely ignored this responsibility. Amy Goodman has not. Her determination to give people a voice has taken her to some of the globe's most dangerous places. Reporting on the U.S.-backed Indonesian occupation in East Timor, she and a colleague witnessed a massacre of civilians by Indonesian troops and were themselves brutally beaten. But they filled the silence. Their documentary, Massacre, The Story of East Timor, won numerous prizes, including the Robert F. Kennedy Prize for International Reporting and the Alfred I. DuPont Columbia Silver Baton. In 1998, she reported from Nigeria on the exploitation of its people by Chevron Oil and the country's dictatorship. Her work culminated in the award-winning radio documentary, Drilling and Killing, Chevron and Nigeria's Oil Dictatorship. The Washington Post calls Goodman, and I quote, a reporter who sinks her teeth in and never lets go. Her fierce and always independent voice can be heard regularly on Democracy Now!, the Pacifica radio show she hosts and helped launch nearly a decade ago on New York's WBAI. Welcome to the Cambridge Forum, Amy Goodman.
Okay. Well, it's a great honor to be here, and to be here with my brother and co-author David Goodman, to be here with Noam, to be here with my family, my mom, Dari Goodman, my brother, Dan Goodman, and my sister-in-law, Sue Minter, and so many of you who, like so many people around the country, are deeply concerned about what's taking place today. I come from Pacifica Radio, which was founded 55 years ago this past week, founded by a man named Lou Hill, who was a World War II conscientious objector. When he came out of the detention camps, he said, there has to be a media outlet that is run by journalists and artists and not corporations that profit from war. And so Pacifica was born, not run by corporations that George Gerbner, founder of the Cultural Environment Movement, said, corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell that are raising our children today. KPFA was the first Pacifica station. Founded in Berkeley, California in 1949. April 15th, 1949 at 3 o'clock, Lou Hill went on the air and welcomed people to the airwaves of KPFA. This year, as David and I go around the country celebrating community media that is the exception to the rulers, like WZBC from Brooklyn College that broadcasts Democracy Now!, and Boston College, and CCTV, Cambridge Community Television, and Newton Community Television as well, and maybe some of you can shout out the different TV stations or radio stations that you honor and also that broadcast Democracy Now! We were at 3 o'clock on April 15th at Prison Radio Project in San Francisco. That was the exact moment that KPFA went on the air 55 years ago. A young Fresno Bee reporter had asked me what I would be doing at that moment on that day this year. Well, the phone rang and I picked it up. There was a recording warning me that I was about to speak to a prisoner. And then the familiar words on a move. It was Mumia Abu-Jamal from death row in Pennsylvania. We had a 15-minute conversation. Every few minutes it was interrupted by the tape recording, warning me that it was a prisoner and I could hang up if I wanted to. And at the end of the 15 minutes, the phone went dead. That was his allotted time. Yes, Mumia Abu-Jamal is on death row, found guilty of a crime he says he is innocent of. I can't think of a more fitting way to observe Pacifica Radio's anniversary than to go to where the silence is, where so many are being held now. 2 million people in prison in this country, the largest prison population in the world, and on death row, thousands of people. We are so used to hearing the small group of pundits on television who know so little about so much pontificate on every issue. But it's our role as journalists to go as close to the story as possible, to bring you people describing their experiences for themselves. And so when we talk about prisons, let's hear from prisoners. When we talk about one of the most controversial policies in this country, that is the death penalty, let's hear from people on death row. Mumia Abu-Jamal doesn't talk about his own case. He talks about the situation of people in prison. He talks about the irony of father hunger, that so many young men in prison don't know their fathers, and here he is, a father and grandfather, a father figure to them. He can't be that to his own children. He talks about capital punishment being punishment for those without capital. And those are the kind of commentaries he offers us. Pacifica Radio is invaluable because it is a sanctuary for dissent, what all media should be in this country. After KPFA went on the air from Berkeley, KPFK in Los Angeles, and then WBAI in New York, WPFW in Washington, D.C., and KPFT in Houston, Texas, on the air in 1970. The only radio station in the country in its first year of operation, its transmitter was blown up twice by the Ku Klux Klan. And when the Exalted Cyclops, or was it the Grand Dragon, I often confuse them, went on trial, he said it was his proudest act because he understood how dangerous Pacifica Radio is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, that breaks down the stereotypes and the caricatures that fuel the bigotry, that feed hate groups like the KKK. In the 1950s, the great singer, actor, intellectual, scholar, activist, Paul Robeson, was whitelisted from almost every place, public place in this country, but a few black churches. But he could be heard on KPFA. Then James Baldwin, the great civil rights activist and writer, debating Malcolm X in the early 1960s on the effectiveness of nonviolent civil disobedience, the lunch counter sit-ins in the South, broadcast over the airwaves of WBAI. Yes, it is so important we have a forum in this country where people can speak and people can listen and hear people form a thought, actually give a speech, hear someone critically think, develop a thought that might be different from others from beginning to end, and break this soundbite culture, 8 or 9 seconds, where the only thing you can repeat is the accepted non-wisdom, the establishment consensus. I have a lot of hope because media activism is on the rise. Yes, the networks are using public property. NBC, CBS, ABC. It's not just Pacifica or NPR or PBS that are using the public airwaves. They are too. And they have a responsibility, despite the fact that during the Persian Gulf War, CBS was owned by Westinghouse, NBC was owned by General Electric, 2 of the major nuclear weapons manufacturers, making most of the parts for most of the weapons in the Persian Gulf War. What they presented looked like a military hardware show. Despite the fact these corporations are using these airwaves, they are not theirs. And we can reclaim them, or we can demand that they use them responsibly. I often tell a quick story about my experience during the Persian Gulf War. One night on WBAI after the news, it was during fundraising, and I was railing against the bombing of the cradle of civilization, Back to the Cradle. And a volunteer ran in who was taking phone calls, and she said the Sally Jesse Raphael show is on the line. And I said, right. And I just kept on going. She said, no, really, really. And she kept coming in. And volunteers are the heart of every community radio station. I just thought this one was hallucinating. So because she kept interrupting, I said, okay, give me the phone. I picked it up, and sure enough, she was right. And there was a producer from the Sally Jesse Raphael show. She said she had been listening in her limousine. I guess her chauffeur had turned on the program. And she wanted to know if I'd like to come on the show in 2 days. They wanted to have a panel discussion about the war, 3 women for and against the war. I said, sure. And I, thought about what to wear, this big, women's talk show that millions of women watch, and whether to dress as a man, dressed as a woman, dressed as a man, dressed as a woman. But I decided, I figured it out, and I went on down. And they kept the 2 groups, the anti and pro women, in 2 different green rooms because they said they wanted us to duke it out on the stage and only meet then. That's where the fireworks would be. And actually, this producer I thought was onto something. She said, I am so sick and tired of these programs, these sensational shows that so many people watch. I want to prove we can get the ratings on an issue that matters. And I said, that's a very good idea. So we went out on the stage, and the lights went on, music went up. Sally came out, and she immediately gave the mic to someone in the audience who said, I'm really concerned about the biological and chemical weapons of Saddam Hussein. And the woman sitting next to me, named Dr. Yolanda Hewitt-Vaughn, an Army captain who was trained as a doctor, and she was refusing to go to the Gulf. She said she was trained to save lives and not take them. She responded. She said, I share your concern, but I also think it's important to know that there are chemical and biological weapons right here in the United States. And before she could get out the word states, Sally whirled around. She came barreling down the aisle, and she was shouting, you be quiet, you shut up, this is my show, or you get out. Now, I hadn't seen this show very much, but I remembered what this young producer had said about, I want you to get out there and duke it out. And she was coming down with such velocity, I thought she was going to strike Dr. Yolanda Hewitt-Vaughn. And so as she is coming up on the stage, I said, whoa, Sally, back off. Now, they had told us to bring our friends with us, and I brought a bunch of people from WBAI, so they started to chant, free speech, free speech. You can dress them up, but you can't take them anywhere. So anyway, Sally started to break down. Her producers came out, they were rocking her back and forth, and they were saying, it's okay, Sally, it's okay. It was the one moment of unity for the 6 women on the stage who disagreed on every other issue. But we looked in shock, and it really was as if she had never heard an anti-war point of view. Somehow the producers convinced her to carry on with the taping of the program. And we went on. And she showed videotape of protesters in Washington, and she asked me, who are these people? I know, I didn't know everyone's name, but I said, these are people engaged in their patriotic duty, what they think it is, and they're going out into the streets. Now, I said, I applaud you for not just showing the images of the protests, which is the best we can expect from the rest of the media. And most people don't identify with 10 or 100,000 people marching in the streets. It's rather alienating, I think, to most Americans. But why did they do it? Well, they're not invited into a corporate network studio to explain in a civilized way, say like Henry Kissinger is invited, to explain why he supports every invasion. No, they have to gather together, and remember the Persian Gulf War, the middle of winter, freezing cold, leaving the warmth of their home and their families and their TV sets, coming down to Washington. And they can only hope that on a global warming day, a CBS executive might open their window, and that chant of no war will waft in and hit an open microphone. But I really said to Sally, you've gone beyond, and you're having a discussion, and I applaud you for that. And we kept on going. Had talked about a lot of things. I said, as the granddaughter of an Orthodox rabbi, it horrifies me to see little Israeli children with gas masks, but it's more horrifying to see little Palestinian children without gas masks. And that's the kind of conversation that we had. My grandfather isn't alive today. He died about 10 years ago at the age of 94. That's because he smoked 4 packs of unfiltered cigarettes a day. But my grandmother has just celebrated her 107th birthday. So we're... Anyway, at the end of this program, I thought it went pretty well. And a cameraman gave me a thumbs-up sign, went back to BAI, and we knew it would air in 2 days. And the 2 days passed, and the show didn't air. And people were calling, and I called the show. I said, "What's up?" And they said, there was a problem with the syncing of the video and the sound tracks. And I thought of that, but that cameraman giving me the thumbs-up sign, he didn't seem very concerned. I said, "How did you learn this?" And they said, from 2 stations, Minneapolis and Chicago called and said they couldn't use it. So I said, uh-huh. And they said, "But we'll have you back another time." I said, "Right. You know you can't, because Dr. Yolanda Hewitt-Vaughn was about to be court-martialed. In fact, she served in the brig. She was jailed for a year and a half, her husband raising their 3 small children alone. The other day we were in St. Louis, and I was giving a talk, and afterwards a young man came up and said, "Would you sign my book?" I said, "Yeah, who do I write it to?" And he said, "My name is Emiliano Hewitt-Vaughn," and he was Yolanda's son. And so obviously, this show was not going to take place again. So I called these 2 stations in Chicago and Minneapolis, and I asked for the operations director and said, "What's up?" And they said, "Odd, you should ask, since we haven't aired it," but I said I was a concerned viewer. And they said that the Sally Jessy Raphael show had recalled it from New York. So I called back the show, and I said, "The jig's up. I'd like to speak to the executive producer." And they said, "He's a very busy man." So people were just inundating us. "When's the show going to happen?" I said, "Don't call us. Call the Sally Jessy Raphael show." And I guess they got a bunch of calls. No, I guess they got a lot of calls. Maybe hundreds. I don't know, maybe thousands. All I know is that 2 days later, I got a call from a frantic high-level producer who said, "The executive producer would like to talk to you." I said, "I'm a very busy woman." And they asked if I would cry censorship if they edited the program. I said, "Of course not. I'm an editor, too. You have a right. It's your show. I assume you'll edit out Sally's fit." And they did. They did, but the show ran the next day. Because they held it, it ran with headlines that said, "Things Get Messy with Sally Jessy." But the most interesting response I got, and this is, I think, something we learn more and more, how important media activism is. It would never have aired if it weren't for all the people who made this show happen. The most interesting response was from women on Southern military bases who called up to say, "We've never heard this view before on television, and we agree with you. We only whisper it around here," they said. "We can't have these debates on military bases. We rely on you in civilian society." And that's what the media is supposed to be here for serving a democratic society, sort of like a large national kitchen table that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day: war and peace, life and death. And anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country. Yes, your activism can make an enormous difference. We are living in very dire times right now. Time with the leading up to the invasion of Iraq, where we have a media that has iced out almost all dissent. You look at the week leading up to Colin Powell giving an address at the UN Security Council pushing for war, and the week after, this was February 5th, 2003, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, the Media Watch Group in New York, did a study of those 2 weeks of the 4 major nightly newscasts, NBC, CBS, ABC, and PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. On those 2 weeks of broadcast, there were 393 interviews done around war. 3 were with anti-war representatives. 3 of almost 400 at a most critical time. Now, that you can't even call mainstream media. That is an extremist media, and it doesn't reflect mainstream America, because at that time, most people were opposed to the invasion. They were for more inspections and diplomacy. That is a media beating the drums for war, and that has got to be changed. And then you look at how the media covered the invasion. Just a few small examples. The night, March 19th, that the bombs started to fall, Dan Rather said, "Good morning, Baghdad." And then you had Tom Brokaw of NBC saying,
We don't want to destroy the infrastructure of Iraq because we're going to own that country in a few days. And then you had the networks, not just Fox, but MSNBC, NBC, CNN, all adopting the name that the Pentagon had carefully researched for its propagandistic value, Operation Iraqi Freedom. Actually, they'd come up with another name before, Operation Iraqi Liberation, but they couldn't use it, this according to counterpunch.org, because of the acronym OIL. So they came up with Operation Iraqi Freedom. And you expect that, that's the Pentagon. But for the networks to use the Pentagon's name as the title of their own coverage, you really have to ask, if we had state media in this country, how would it be any different? Right now, the invasion, the occupation, it is so dire in Fallujah, the minarets being blown up, and the U.S. military saying, well, at least it wasn't the mosque in this city of mosques. The minaret's so symbolic, it's where the call to prayer emanates from, so significant for Muslims all over the world. And what about the people who are dying? The U.S. military says it's insurgents who are dying, and yet the doctors and nurses in the hospital saying, no, it's hundreds of women and children. I mean, when you have these C-150 gunships that are strafing and bombing the whole city, do you think they can pick out the insurgents from the kids? And you have a country now, George Bush has managed to do something Saddam Hussein has never managed to do, and that is unite the Sunnis and the Shia. And now the Sufi clerics, the most apolitical in Iraq, have called for their followers to join the resistance. We know how many U.S. soldiers have died, and it is horrific, more than 700. We don't know how many Iraqi civilians have died. More than 10,000, we believe. And also the injured. More than 18,000 U.S. soldiers have been medically evacuated from Iraq. We don't hear these numbers. But the civilians, the Iraqi civilians, whose numbers we don't know, whose names we don't know, this was the country, these were the people that the U.S. administration said we went in to save and to liberate. It matters, and it matters to the whole world. This week, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is holding hearings on John Negroponte to replace Paul Bremer as U.S. ambassador to Iraq. John Negroponte. What's interesting is you're hardly going to hear anything about this in the media because of how the media works. The media reflects the establishment consensus that is set by the Democrats and the Republicans. Sorry, any water? The media reflects the establishment consensus. Before the invasion, why doesn't this happen when President Bush holds a news conference? Before the invasion, the Democrats agreed with the Republicans, right? Let's not forget John Kerry, John Edwards. They voted for the invasion of Iraq. Now the Democrats are trying to distinguish themselves. And so there is more debate, and that's what the media reflects. It's not that the media has gotten any better. It's that as they follow the establishment in Washington, there's a little more of a division, and that's what they're reflecting. Not so on John Negroponte. People like Christopher Dodd, who objected to him being named U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, now says that he supports John Negroponte. John Negroponte, U.S. Ambassador to Honduras, 1981 to 1985. This was the staging ground for the illegal Contra War. Thousands of Nicaraguans killed at this time. Yes, in Honduras alone, the CIA-backed trained Battalion 316, also responsible for the deaths of many Hondurans. One high-level State Department official said in 1982, when he was preparing the State Department report on Honduras, that John Negroponte personally made him purge from it any reference to disappearances and murders, any references to death squads in Honduras. We have continually this week had on the air nuns and priests talking about their personal appeals to Honduran Ambassador John Negroponte at the time for the missing and the disappeared in Honduras. And now this is the man who will most likely be soon approved to be the next U.S. ambassador to Iraq, who will preside over the largest embassy in the world, the largest U.S. embassy in the world, 3,000 people, 500 CIA in Iraq. He will be in charge of counterinsurgency to give us a picture of what is to come. But now that the Democrats have said they will raise no objection, you know that the media will also not go back and look at the record. We need a media that gives us history, that gives us context, that gives us truth. I just have a few minutes, and I am very eager to hear what Noam has to say. And so I want to end with a story that, well, I first heard about because Noam Chomsky never let this story die, and that is what happened to the people of East Timor and the lesson it provides for all of us. Noam wrote about it from way back, December 1975. Indonesia invaded East Timor, Indonesia invaded East Timor. 90% of the weapons used were from the United States. Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford, the president then, went to Indonesia, met with Suharto, the long-reigning dictator, and gave the go-ahead for the invasion. What happened after that? Well, the first days, extremely bloody, thousands of Timorese killed. And as Kissinger came back to the United States, he was getting cables from high-level State Department officials saying, we've got to watch out because Congress will cut off military aid to Indonesia. When he came back to the United States, he held a high-level meeting with State Department officials, castigating them for leaving a paper trail saying, we will not kick our ally in the teeth. The note-taker for that meeting, Jerry Bremer, the nickname for L. Paul Bremer. Yes, he learned well at his master's knee. It does matter that we document what happens so that history doesn't repeat itself as we see it happening today. And so the Indonesian military killed off the people of Timor, closing off the country to the outside world. In 1990 and 91, my colleague Alan Nairn and I got a chance to go to East Timor. And in 91, in 90, first saw this hell on earth that was the Indonesian military dictatorship in Timor. In 91, we went back because the UN had finally brokered an agreement that would allow a fact-finding mission to go in and investigate the human rights situation. And we wanted to see what would happen when this delegation came, which never did, because we later learned the US didn't want this delegation to come. On November 12, 1991, we followed a procession of Timorese, thousands of them, from a church to a cemetery, the Santa Cruz Cemetery. They were protesting yet another killing of a Timorese young man, and they carried banners. Girls took them out of their Catholic school blouses that said, "Why the Indonesian military shoot our church?" Old women in traditional Timorese garb, boys in their Catholic school shorts marched through the streets, through this geography of pain. Every other building, a police barracks or a military headquarters or even a hotel where Timorese were disappeared or tortured at the back. And they walked through the streets until they got to the cemetery. When they got there, we talked to people, why are you doing this? And everyone said the same thing, for my father, for my mother, for my village, it was wiped out. And then we saw from the direction the procession had come, hundreds of Indonesian soldiers carrying their US M16s at the ready position. The people were horrified. The soldiers were marching up 12 to 15 abreast. They couldn't escape because there were walls on either side of the road. Alan suggested we walk to the front of the crowd because although we knew that the Indonesian military had committed these massacres in the past, they'd never done it in front of Western journalists, and we thought maybe we could head off the attack. This time, though, I took out my equipment because we'd always hidden it in the past so as not to endanger the Timorese if they were caught talking to Western journalists. I put the headphones on, my microphone above my head. Alan put the camera above his head, and we walked to the front of the crowd. Soldiers marched up, and without any warning or provocation or hesitation, they rounded the corner, they swept past us, and they opened fire on the crowd, gunning people down from right to left. The first to go down, a boy behind us with his hands in the V sign. And the soldiers just kept shooting. They beat me to the ground. Alan threw himself on top of me to protect me from further injury, and they took their US M16s like baseball bats, and they slammed them against his skull until they fractured it. We were lying in the ground. They were killing everyone around us. They put the guns to our heads, a group of them, and they were shouting, "Politique, politique," because to bear witness is political, to witness such a crime. And then they started shouting, "Australia, Australia," because 17 years before, right before the invasion, there were 6 journalists working for 2 Australian TV crews that were covering the events leading up to the invasion. They lined up 5 against a house and they executed them. The 6th, Roger East, the day after the invasion, reporting for the world about what was happening from a radio station in Dili. They dragged him out of the radio station, and as he shouted, "I'm from Australia," they shot him into the harbor. And so there they were shouting, "Australia, were we from Australia?" We said, "No, America, America." Not after the journalists were killed in 1975, the Australian government hardly raised a peep in protest. Maybe that was explained by several years later, the Australian and Indonesian foreign ministers rode in a plane over the Timor Gap, and they signed a treaty that divided up the oil spoils, not with Timor, but between Indonesia and Australia. Oil has caused so much pain in the world. So we lay on the ground. Alan was covered in blood. We're saying, "America, America." They'd stripped us of everything. I only had my passport left, and I threw it at them. And at some point, they decided to take the guns from our heads, maybe because we were from the same country their weapons were from. They'd have to pay a price for killing us that they'd never had to pay for killing the Timorese. And they moved on, and they killed so many Timorese. They killed more than 270 Timorese. A Red Cross Jeep pulled up. We were able to get in it. Dozens of Timorese jumped on top of us and on top of the Jeep, and we drove like that as a human mass to the hospital. When we got there, the doctors and nurses who saw us started to cry, not because we were in worse shape than the Timorese, but because I think of what we represent to not only the people of Timor, but people all over the world. We represent the sword and the shield. The sword because we provide so many weapons to so many repressive regimes in the world, or the US government uses them themselves. But we also represent the shield. And that shield on that day was bloody, and it just deepened their despair. What we do in this country makes such an enormous difference to the rest of the world. I recently interviewed a woman from Guyana on Democracy Now! About globalization. And after the conversation, I said, "Thank you very much." And we were going to go on to a conversation about the US elections. And she said, "I'll be staying for that conversation." I said, "Well, no, we're done with this conversation on globalization." She said, "No, I'm going to be a part of your conversation on the US elections." And I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I believe everyone in the world should get to vote for President of the United States." But what we do in this country really does matter. 10 years later, the Timorese, though suffering an unbelievably high price, ultimately did win their freedom. They got to vote in 1999 for their independence. And in May 19th, 20th, 2002, Alan Nairn and I returned to celebrate with the people of East Timor. May 19th at midnight, 100,000 people at Tasitolo, a sandy plain outside of Dili. They gathered. They watched the rebel leader, now the founding president of East Timor, ascend the stage, Xanana Gusmao, and raise the flag of the Democratic Republic of East Timor. As the fireworks went off, the Timorese looked up, and you could see the light reflected in their tear-stained faces. This nation of survivors had prevailed at an unbelievably high price, but they had resisted and they had won. It is a lesson to all of us that persistence, that kind of unbelievable struggle, but with the solidarity of people all over the world, does make a difference, and that people right here in this country who organized for many years to help the people of Timor, an amazing organization called the East Timor Action Network that lobbied and educated people, and so many others learned and wrote to Congress members and even went to East Timor and did things, that all of them taught us that it really does make a difference what we do every day, that we have a decision to make in every action, every hour of every day, whether we want to represent the sword or the shield. Democracy Now! Thank you.
The New York Times once called Noam Chomsky arguably the most important intellectual alive. He's the author of some 70 books and ranks with Marx, Shakespeare, and the Bible among the 10 most quoted sources in the humanities of all time. In a lengthy profile last year, The New Yorker called him one of the greatest minds of the 20th century and one of the most reviled. Of course, Professor Chomsky has had a few choice words about the news media as well, but I will leave those to him. Welcome to the Cambridge Forum, Noam Chomsky.
Is this going to work, or do I have to go through Amy's routine? Can you hear me? Oh, great. So I'll leave it there. Well, I was asked by John Grebe, who's around here somewhere, to inform you that he's running Democracy Now! On the radio at the Boston College campus community radio, and they're trying to gain support to keep it going. There should be some forms going around. I don't know if there are. According to this announcement, there are. And he asked me to ask you, and I'm glad to do so, that you sign the forms. They're either in the audience or table by the door. And if you have any Boston College affiliation, to indicate that on the form as well. So that's a way to overcome the fact that this is one of the few cities, important cities, where it's very hard to hear Democracy Now! You have to work, and that's a shame, because it ought to be available. I understand from John that the station there has a pretty wide outreach, so if it does get played, it should be heard around much of the city. So I urge you to do that. Well, I guess the next thing I have to do, though, I'm reluctant to do it, is get involved in a family quarrel. That's always a bad mistake. And I could evade it by saying truthfully that I never knew anybody named George Goodman. I actually did know somebody named Gedalia Goodman, who that may be who they're referring to. I don't know if they know his name, actually. He and I were campers together, not counselors, at a Hebrew-speaking camp. But anyone who thinks it through should know that that story can't be correct, because it was also a kosher camp. And you're not allowed to take a bite out of a live animal. That's, so that couldn't have happened. But he was the best quarter miler in the camp, I can tell you that. Well, I thought, since I figured they'd be slamming the media as a counterpoint, I ought to defend the media, so picked out a couple of stories from today's paper and yesterday's paper just to show you what you can learn from the media. Actually, one of the things you can learn is what we're all missing right now. According to the Boston Globe this morning, there's a PBS Frontline documentary running right now, which is headlined, I only have the description of it in this morning's paper, a timely look at how faith informs Bush presidency. And if you haven't looked at it, you should. I can't blow it up, but it's the picture here of George, very serious look, prayerfully telling us what we're supposed to believe. And behind him is a painting of Jesus, I guess it's Jesus Christ, kind of like this. George carefully placed right beneath him, pastel colors. Those of you who've traveled to Europe know it's the kind of cheap reproduction that they sell for a dime or something outside of, on the street in Italy. But it's to convey the profound commitment of the president to faith. And it says it's about his spiritual development, and this solid linear piece which you're missing is timely for the presidential campaign and relevant to the Bush messianic mission to graft democracy onto the rest of the world. Notice that's a fact, right? This is described as a fact. There is a Bush messianic mission to graft democracy onto the rest of the world. And we know that it's a fact because we have evidence for it. The evidence is that he said so. In fact, if you examine it, you'll notice that's the total evidence. But I obviously haven't read everything, but ever since, when the pretexts for the invasion of Iraq began to collapse and you needed some new ones, the new one turned out to be Bush's messianic mission to graft democracy onto the rest of the world. And that was affirmed by the president in a visionary speech. I don't know if they had Christ standing over him then at the National Endowment for Democracy last November. And I, out of curiosity, read as much as I could of the reporting and commentary after that. And believe it or not, I have yet to find one report, news report or commentary, that doesn't take it for granted, presuppose that this was, in fact, the goal. There are critics, plenty of critics. The critics say it's a noble and generous messianic mission, but it's beyond reach, or maybe those people aren't ready for it, or it'll cost us too much or something. But I've been looking pretty hard and asking other people to look to see if they can find anyone who questions that this is the mission, which is pretty remarkable, because if you believe that that is the mission, you have to assume that George Bush and Tony Blair are some of the most accomplished liars in history. After all, they were telling us straight out that, as Bush put it, the single question is whether Saddam Hussein is going to get rid of those weapons of mass destruction with which he's threatening us and end his ties with al-Qaeda. That's the single question. But it turns out that was all a lie, and that it was really a messianic mission to bring democracy to the Middle East, and the independent adversarial media have to, and commentators, because this is all over the intellectual culture, it's not just the media, have to quickly shift gears and find that, oh yeah, this was the mission all along, and the fact that they were lying to us before, we sort of forget about. It's even farther back than Honduras. Yes, whatever that was. And we have to believe in this one. Almost everyone does. In fact, if you read the article carefully, you find you really can learn things from the media. So the article talks about how Bush's spiritual development took place. And it turns out that the crucial change was when he was working on his father's campaign in 1987 as a link between the campaign and the evangelical community. And he was reading all the memoranda that were passing through and had a spiritual awakening. He realized that if you appeal to the evangelicals in the country pretending to be religious, then, I could do this in Texas and become governor. And then another commentator says, advisor to Bush the Elder, says that the message did come home. After the election, he said, "My God, you could win the White House with nothing but evangelicals." So that's a real spiritual conversion, and we can see that there was a profound change in his conception of the world, and therefore it's quite right that he should be facing us with the portrait of the painting of Christ in the background. Well, that's what you're missing right now, so sorry. Can I give you a second-hand report of it? Actually, if you look further in the media, there also are serious articles on Bush's messianic vision to bring democracy to the Middle East. Here's one from the Wall Street Journal a couple days ago by a very good correspondent, very knowledgeable correspondent, Carla Ann Robbins, and it's about Mr. Negroponte. So just to counter what Amy was saying about the media, they do report things about him. If you go to the right journals, like the Wall Street Journal, where they have a trustworthy audience and they can kind of tell people things that you might not read elsewhere. The subheading, it says, Negroponte has tricky mission. And then the subheading is modern proconsul. Okay? And it begins by saying that as the ambassador to Honduras in the 80s, Negroponte was known as the proconsul, a title given to powerful administrators in colonial times. And now he's been chosen to take up that same role in Iraq, assuming, there's one problem, assuming that the Pentagon is willing to cede its control. So the big question then is whether the Pentagon will control Iraq after we transfer full sovereignty to them, or whether the proconsul, the modern proconsul, will run Iraq the way he ran Honduras. I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but a day or two after Negroponte's appointment was announced, the government of Honduras withdrew its forces from Iraq. Not many, a couple of dozen, I guess, but it might have been a coincidence. Or maybe they remember something from what happened there, the kinds of things that Amy was telling you about. He did have a job. He had quite an embassy there, not the size of the one he's going to be running in Iraq, but in Honduras, which, as you know, is a kind of centerpiece of world power. He had a huge embassy with 1,000 people. He had a huge embassy. He ran one of the biggest embassies in the country, in the world, and he also had the biggest CIA station in the world in Honduras. Obviously, terribly important place for the CIA to concentrate. And he had two jobs there, the article explains. One was to ensure that Congress didn't get upset about the fact that the Honduran security forces were carrying out tortures and massacres. It's famous Battalion 316 that Amy was talking about. He had to deny those so that the military aid would keep coming for him to be able to carry out his major task, which was, of course, supervising the Contra camps in Honduras from which the CIA mercenary army was attacking Nicaragua. Not a small affair. The death toll in Nicaragua from the U.S. terrorist war based in Honduras per capita, relative to population, would be the same as about 2.5 million dead in the United States, which turns out to be higher than the total number of American deaths in all wars in U.S. history, including the Civil War. So from the Nicaraguan point of view, this was not a small event. It did lead to establishing democracy with a gun at their heads after Bush warned them that this is going to go on unless they vote for our candidate. This is Bush number one. Nicaraguans voted for the U.S. candidate, were rewarded for that by, there was tremendous applause in the United States. The New York Times had big headlines saying, Americans united in joy, kind of like North Koreans. Americans united in joy at the victory for U.S. fair play. Yeah, that's pretty much what happened. Since then, since the U.S. took it over again, Again, by accident, Haiti happens to be the main target of U.S. military intervention in the 20th century. Nicaragua's second, but that's just another coincidence. About 60% of Nicaraguan children under 2 are now suffering from severe anemia from malnutrition, meaning probable permanent brain damage. About half the active labor force is out of the country because there's no way to survive there. But it is regularly described in the Wall Street Journal, too, as an economic miracle where you can buy anything you want, which is true. There are 24-hour malls open for people who can afford it, and then you can buy computers and plenty of great place for retired Americans to go. They can live very cheaply in wonderful mansions and so on. But for children under 2, the prospects are permanent brain damage, and that's what we call a victory for democracy. So that tells you something about the Bush's messianic vision to bring democracy to Iraq using the same experienced official, and we don't have to go on about the kind of democracy that he brought to Honduras, or that the present incumbents in their Reaganite phase brought to the rest of Central America. But that we're supposed to forget about. Actually, I didn't quite tell the truth when I said I couldn't find any comment after the president's visionary speech questioning whether the goal was to bring democracy to Iraq. Actually, I did find one. There was a column in the Washington Post by good correspondent Walter Pincus a couple of days after the president's speech, which reported a poll in Baghdad. And the poll in Baghdad, if you read through the column, asked people to say in their own words why they thought the United States invaded Iraq. And there were some who agreed with unanimous U.S. commentary after the president announced his vision. There were some in Baghdad who said that they thought the goal was to bring democracy to Iraq, 1%. So there was a comment saying not everybody agrees. 5% thought that the goal was to help Iraqis. The rest believed something that we're not allowed to say here. You can't find it discussed or commented on or anything. But the rest of them say, well, the goal was to take control of Iraq's resources and to reorganize, use control of Iraq to reorganize the Middle East in the general interests of the United States. Of all the reasons that have been offered for the war, that's one I've never seen discussed. Or if it is mentioned, it said, well, some lunatics like Osama bin Laden may believe this, or maybe Amy Goodman believes it, but nobody sensible, except for almost everybody in Baghdad. And it's not unusual for people at the wrong end of the club to have a more accurate vision of the world than those who are wielding the club in many situations. Actually, the Iraqi responses, if you look, were more sophisticated than I just indicated. 1% said the American goal was to bring democracy to Iraq, but 50% said the U.S. wants democracy in Iraq. Okay? Sounds like a contradiction. It isn't. If you read the whole statement, they said, half of them said, yes, the United States wants democracy in Iraq, but it will not permit Iraqis to determine their own future without U.S. influence. That means the proconsul is going to determine what happens. So democracy will be great as long as you do what we say. There's a condition on democracy. Again, they understand us better than we choose to understand ourselves. That is the history, not just the United States, but elsewhere. Honduras was not the only country that decided to pull out troops. As you, of course, know, Spain had a vote in March where the population voted out the government that had gone to war over the objection of maybe 90% of the population, and was greatly praised here by those who are carrying out the messianic mission to bring democracy. was greatly praised for having demonstrated its democratic credentials by following orders from Crawford, Texas, instead of 90% of the population. That was much more general, in fact. But Spain did vote them out of office last March and voted in a government which announced that its electoral program was that it would withdraw the troops from Iraq unless they were under UN supervision. And that led to a lot of commentary here, a lot of condemnation of the Spanish as weak and appeasing terrorism and all sorts of terrible things. One comment that I didn't notice was that the Spanish voters voted for what is pretty much the position of about 70% of Americans. Last December, in the most in-depth poll yet taken, 70% of Americans said, as in fact they'd been saying since April, that the UN ought to take the lead in civil order control in Iraq, in economic reconstruction, and in working with Iraqis to arrange a transfer of full sovereignty, which is pretty much what the Spanish voters voted for. So they voted for what 70% of Americans believe, but there's a difference between Spain and America, and it's a very important difference. One difference is that in Spain, people know what public opinion is. In the United States, very few people know what public opinion is. I mean, if you go to the right websites and you read the studies by the University of Maryland Polling Institute, you can find these things out. But very few people know here. The people who answered that question and said, yeah, this is what we think, the UN ought to play the primary role in all these domains, and the U.S. ought to be at part of some multilateral coalition, maybe under UN supervision. Very few of those people know that they're expressing the majority view in the United States, large majority view. A second distinction is that in Spain, you can vote on your opinions. Here you can't. Like that issue is certainly not going to come up in the campaign. The position that 70% of Americans want and that the Spanish voters voted for is not an issue in our campaign. And this is true of issue after issue, internationally, domestically, all sorts of things. So just take the major domestic issue in the United States. Pretty well agreed that the major domestic problem that the United States faces, and a serious one, is exploding healthcare costs. The U.S. healthcare system is far and away the most inefficient in the industrial world, has costs way beyond any other country, and the outcomes are relatively poor down the low end of industrial societies. And every health professional knows the reason for this. It's a privatized system, which means massive administrative costs, lots of filling out paperwork, supervision, detailed supervision over what doctors are allowed to do, huge drug costs up to maybe 10 times as high as, say, Australia. Just to give you some personal examples, we just came back from Greece, where my wife had to get needed some drug. It turned out the drug she got was the same one she uses here, except it was 1/3 the price. And the pharmacists and friends there told us we ought to really stock up on drugs because everything is a fraction of the price of what it is here. Same drugs, same company. They make huge profits in Greece, but they can make bigger profits here. And for all these reasons, the U.S. system is extremely inefficient. Also, just the bureaucratization. My wife had to fill a prescription from the MIT healthcare program today, in fact. I spent about an hour on the phone with the insurance company trying to get them to fill the prescription as the doctor prescribed it. It turned out that he had prescribed, I don't know, I'm kind of making up the facts, 3 pills a week or something. And the only thing they could do was either 2 pills a week or 4 pills a week. That's what the rule was. So they couldn't give her the prescription. She finally got the doctor to call. He spent half an hour arguing with him over the phone. She couldn't do it, so now she's going to figure out how to cut the pills in half or something. But all of those things add up. They add up to huge expenses. And these are inherent parts of a mostly privatized a healthcare system, which is highly bureaucratic, extremely inefficient, and so on. Well, how do American people feel about this? Actually, there are very few polls about it. I think the polling agencies don't want to know the answer, but there are some. There were, for example, one in the Washington Post just a couple of months ago, where it turned out about 80% of the population are in favor of some form of national health care system of the kind that every other country has, even if it meant kept keeping taxes high, which incidentally it wouldn't. It would lower taxes because it would be so much more efficient. And that's pretty consistent. That goes back a long time. And it's occasionally mentioned in the press. When it's mentioned, it's called politically impossible. And that's correct. The pharmaceutical corporations are against it. The insurance companies are against it. So it's politically impossible, just as it's politically impossible for Americans to vote on their preferences as to what should be done in Iraq. There's a name for that. It's a name that we use when we talk about other countries. It's called a failed state, a state that has formal institutions. It has formal democratic institutions, but they don't function. There are plenty of states like that. We call them failed states or elected dictatorships or something of that kind. And if the independent media ought to be pointing out to us that we're one. And as Amy said, matters a lot more to the world if the United States is a failed state than if Honduras is a failed state for pretty obvious reasons. And democracy now is one of the forces that's helping overcome that.
Thank you, Noam Chomsky. You're listening to Cambridge Forum with Amy Goodman, David Goodman, and Noam Chomsky discussing the exception to the rulers. Let me start the questions. I'll start with a question for Amy and David. In the exception to the rulers, you describe the mainstream news media, and you've certainly given examples tonight, as a well-oiled propaganda machine that is repackaging government spin and passing it off as journalism. Yet just yesterday, you announced on Democracy Now! That Ted Koppel will devote his entire edition of Nightline Friday to reading the names of Americans killed in Iraq. And I happened to turn on CNN last night, and it did report a fairly substantial story about a poll showing that 71% of Iraqis consider our troops to be occupiers, not liberators. One man said on the air that Saddam Hussein and President Bush should both be tried for war crimes. It was an Iraqi. My question is, isn't such reporting something more than propaganda?
I think the latest news on the Nightline story, which is very important, that they're going to read the names of dead U.S. servicemen Friday night, is that Sinclair Broadcasting, which owns many of the affiliates that run Nightline, is threatening affiliates. Everything okay? Is threatening affiliates, saying that they cannot run the program tomorrow night. So we'll see what happens with that, and I guess some will not be running the program. I think that there are exceptions, and I think, as I was saying before, when there is a difference between Democrats and Republicans, we see some difference in the media. I think overall you occasionally see exceptions, but now with the Democrats in an election year, and because the situation in Iraq is undeniable, we get occasional good reporting. But I will say, I'll take an example Noam referred to. He just mentioned Haiti. That's another one of these cases where when the Democrats hardly speak out,
In Washington, the media, this just happened the last few weeks, slavishly follows the administration line. February 29th, even if you're extremely observant and you follow the news, you may not realize that there was a U.S.-backed coup that took place in Haiti yet again. This is the oldest black republic in the world, born of a slave uprising. It just celebrated its bicentennial. And on February 29th, according to President Aristide, the democratically elected leader, the second number 2 men in the U.S. Embassy went to the home of the Aristides and told them that they could be killed, thousands of Haitians could die if they don't leave the country, that this group of rebels was going to overrun Port-au-Prince. This is a small group of thugs who were well known. 10 years ago, they and others engaged in a coup against Aristide, once again backed by the United States. My colleague Ellen Nairn exposed in The Nation magazine that the FRAP, the paramilitary death squad, with its leader Manuel Constant, was on the payroll of the U.S. intelligence agencies. That was 10 years ago. Now it's 10 years later. The number 2 man in FRAP, Jodel Chamblain, is the one who's running the show, found guilty of murdering the justice minister of Haiti in '93 and a leading Haitian-American businessman, Antoine Ismery, and others. This is not a popular uprising. It's a small group of murderers who, working with the U.S., were able to force the President Aristide from power. On February 29th, no one exactly knew what happened. Aristide said this guy came to the house, said that they would die, thousands of Haitians would die. Aristide said he asked to speak to the press. Instead, he was taken to a U.S. plane, put on it with dozens of U.S. military and security, and sent off. They didn't know where they were going. When the Aristides tried to lift up the shade, they were told to put it down, and they ended up being dumped in the Central African Republic, a remote area of Africa that has 1 plane out a week, hard to even make a telephone call. We were following the situation very carefully. February 29th, we didn't know what had happened to the Aristides. On March 1st, Monday morning, we got a call from U.S. Congressmember Maxine Waters and Trans-Africa founder Randall Robinson, who said, "Quick, please take this to the airwaves. We've just heard from the Aristides. They're in the Central African Republic." We put out the story, put out the transcript immediately. Reporters in Washington questioned Rumsfeld at the Pentagon, said, "Are these reports of Pacifica true?" He started to laugh. They said, "We asked for an answer, not a laugh." And he said it was ridiculous. I've learned after many years of reporting that when a politician tells you something is ridiculous, you're probably on the right track. But the U.S. media, CNN and others, when U.S. Congressmember Maxine Waters went on the air and said this is what Aristide said, that he was the victim of a modern kidnapping in the service of a coup d'etat backed by the United States, the reporters are saying, "Oh, come on, isn't this a stretch? I mean, what are you trying to say here?" Now, that's actually fine to say to anyone. What evidence do you have, and what leads you to believe this? But did they say the same thing to Rumsfeld when they questioned him, or Powell and Bush on this issue? Anyway, 2 weeks later, or a month later, Congressmember Maxine Waters, Randall Robinson, a member of the Jamaican Parliament, decided to take U.S. foreign policy into their own hands, and they chartered a jet, and they flew to the Central African Republic. I got a chance to accompany them and chronicle this trip, along with Peter Eisner of the Washington Post. We traveled 2/3 of the way around the world, from Miami to St. Thomas to Dakar, Senegal, to Bangui, Central African Republic. Reported on the 7-hour high-stakes negotiation with the dictator. Aristide said to me that night, when the dictator went away for a little while to consider the proposal of releasing the Aristides, he said he's got to call the U.S. and France to get his marching orders. Ultimately, this small group of people called the bluff of the most powerful country on earth. They said, if you're saying he's not a prisoner, if he's a free man, then he can do what he wants to. As Margaret Mead said, never doubt for a moment that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And they brought the Aristides back to this hemisphere. And as we flew over the Atlantic, we heard that Condoleezza Rice, Powell, and Rumsfeld were saying that the Aristides were not to return to this hemisphere. Whose hemisphere? And then U.S. Ambassador James Foley, the ambassador to Haiti, said the Aristides were not to return to within 150 miles of Haiti. Whose country? But Aristide did end up in Jamaica, where he had been invited. And during the whole 9/11 Commission controversy with Condoleezza Rice, if you thought she was all caught up with that, whether or not to speak under oath, in other words, whether or not to tell the truth, she was also very involved with putting pressure once again on Jamaican Prime Minister P.J. Patterson to expel the Aristides. They want to control this country, Haiti, the United States, and they don't want Aristide anywhere near it. It's absolutely critical. We have other
sorry
reports.
to interrupt you, and I really do apologize, but I wanted to open it up to questions if I could. I'm going to hold off on my second question till the end, so there's an opportunity for the audience here. You're joining us at the Cambridge Forum discussing exception to the rulers. The floor is now open for audience questions, but time is short. So please limit your questions to one, keep your comments short, and because there will be a good number of people in line, I'd also ask the panelists if they could keep the answer somewhat short in terms of the questions. Go ahead.
Hi. I wanted to ask a question, Amy, about the story regarding the capture of Saddam Hussein that I understand was reported on Democracy Now! That he had already been captured by the Kurds, and then there had been a negotiated process by which he was put in that foxhole and then miraculously discovered by the U.S. military, partly to say it hasn't been echoed, I don't think, anywhere else, and I'm just curious about more about that story.
Did you heard about that? No? Maybe Noam can comment on it more than they have, but we did.
The story's been, there's no way of verifying it, but yes, it's been reported in the European media and elsewhere. Could be true. Yeah.
That Kurdish soldiers were the first to find him.
But how could we know? If there were reporters on the scene, they could tell you.
Yeah, I had a question for Professor Chomsky. I was wondering that given that the Democrats supported the war in Iraq and, according to Kerry's vow at least, promised to stay the course of Iraq with 40,000 more troops, given that even years before the war, the Democrats, just like you, Professor Chomsky, supported UN sanctions against Iraq, which claimed the lives of millions of children, given that even the most left-wing Democrats, like Maxine Waters, for example, that you had raised, and also like you, Professor Chomsky, don't oppose this racist system of capitalism outright, but rather seek a more rational and enlightened form of imperialism. And given that the masters of the Democratic Party, just like the Republicans, are the capitalists, why have you come out and lined up behind Kerry saying that small differences between Bush and Kerry can lead to very different outcomes? Now, I am with the Spartacus League, and unlike you, we fight for class struggle against imperialism.
I'm sorry, but
we
I'm
fight
going
to
to
build
ask
a
you to get to the
multiracial
question,
working
please.
class party that will fight for socialist revolution. And if you care to find the truth in a newspaper, a working class perspective that takes a side with the workers and tells the truth, check out Workers' Vanguard.
Good idea. First of all these things you said are given are false, and you can easily find that out. Second, everything you said that was given is false. Secondly, did I support the sanctions? I strongly opposed the sanctions. I'm sure I opposed them far more strongly than you did. Look, you had your say. Anyone who wants to find out can. Anyone who wants to check can. Anyone who wants to check can find out. I was bitterly condemning the sanctions, the massacres, and so on, all through the 90s. You can find that out very easily. One point you said is correct. There is small differences in a very powerful system can have large outcomes. If the Spartacus League cared about working people, poor people people elsewhere in the world who suffer and so on, they would care about the large outcomes that follow from those small differences. If you don't care about what happens to those people and you want to live in some abstract seminar somewhere, then you don't care. But it's a fact, and we can't deny it.
I wanted to ask if you guys knew anything, any history about direct action against corporate media, and for example, picketing live broadcasts, any kind of action like that maybe you could give some information on quickly.
I can think of an example about 10 years ago when, I think it was during the Persian Gulf War, when a group of AIDS activists went both to CBS and PBS during the the nightly newscasts, and they started to chant something like "Kill AIDS, not Arabs." And they got into the actual network studios when Dan Rather first came on the air, and the same with the NewsHour with McNeil Lehrer. And they started to speak out. And in Dan Rather's case, they went right to a commercial. And in the McNeil Lehrer NewsHour, they said, you know, these people are concerned about AIDS, and but they actually got into the studios. And of course, there's been major protests outside of networks for a long time, media activists who are protesting their coverage.
There are, if you're interested, large-scale media activist groups now being organized. So most of it's being done, to my knowledge, by Bob McChesney at the University of Illinois, who has quite a popular network going.
Okay. I'd like all three of you to answer the same question, but David Goodman, I already gave you outside a list of some of the countries the U.S. has troops in. Apparently there's 135. I'd ask you to write something about it. Amy Goodman, I'd ask you to have a radio show which tries to explain to us why there are U.S. troops in so many countries. Tonight I'd ask Noam Chomsky to answer briefly, do you think there are different reasons why the U.S. puts troops in different countries, maybe 135 countries, Barbados, Mongolia, as well as some of the ones we've heard of like Colombia and Haiti? Or do you think there's basically one reason why the U.S. puts troops in so many countries? And if so, what is that one reason or many reasons?
Well, I mean, there is an overriding reason, namely if you want to be a world dominant power, you're going to have military bases scattered as a way of exercising that power when needed. So yes, there's one overriding reason, and that goes right back to the end of the beginning of the Second World War. When before the Second World War, the United States was not a major player on the world scene, was regionally a little bit in the Pacific and so on. It was obvious at the beginning of the Second World War that the U.S. was going to come out of the war as the world dominant power, and it intended to maintain that power by the use of force if necessary. In fact, Bush's national strategic strategy that caused so much anger, rightly, virtually echoes internal studies of the State Department and the Council on Foreign Relations back in 1941 in almost the same terms. So yes, there is an overriding reason. But then, of course, you look at the particular places, there are separate reasons. So the troops around the Andean region are there because the Andean region's in turmoil and they're surrounded by U.S. military bases. It's a very strategically very important area for the U.S. It's a potential source of energy on which the U.S. expects to rely. There are a lot of popular forces there, and my own suspicion was, frankly, that if the Iraq War hadn't been so grotesquely mishandled by the Pentagon managers, an astonishing failure, they probably would have invaded the Andes by now. But that's what the bases are there for, and in other places they're there for other specific reasons.
I wanted to apologize to the long line of people there. Because we have had three wonderful speakers tonight and not one, I'm only going to be able to take three more questions. So, next questioner.
I'll try to make it I'll try to make it quick. This is another Saddam question. I read in Share International magazine over a year ago that Saddam had died on April 20. Also, recently they published that the Saddam that was found is not the real Saddam, that it's a lookalike. I haven't seen major media delve into this any further, request genetic proof or anything else. Do you have any comments on it?
I'm very skeptical, frankly, but there's no evidence, but I'd be very surprised if that were true. I don't know. Frankly, I don't think it matters for what you do.
Go ahead.
Contrary to what was said here tonight, the New York Times did not say that Professor Chomsky is arguably the most important intellectual alive, and for some reason the professor has allowed this myth to persist over the years. Rather, it was an outsider who had a review in the New York Times book review section, Professor Paul Robinson. For some strange reason, you have not corrected that myth. Now, as to the Goodman book, I find much that's comical and misinformation here, particularly your capital punishment.
Please, question,
Why
please.
do you perpetuate the lie in your book that the race of the victim determines who gets capital punishment? This is a well-known myth debunked by issue number 116 of the Public Interest magazine. And your biggest lie, perhaps, is your failure to acknowledge
Excuse me,
that
you've
the
asked
reason
the question.
blacks
Please
are
stop.
on death row is because they are killing, committing murders in excess of their numbers. Why haven't you got the
Please
to admit that?
sit down. Thank you.
If you would like a comment on the Paul Robinson review, you're correct. The line that was quoted was from a review by Paul Robinson, and every time anybody mentions it and I have a chance, I say, why don't you quote the next sentence, which said, yeah, arguably the most important intellectual alive. How could he write such horrible things and terrible things about the United States? That was the next line, which also ought to be quoted. I don't know what your point was, but yes, that's been said over and over. Go ahead.
But I'm glad you brought up the death penalty. I think if you want to get information or facts on it, a great place to go is the National Coalition to abolish the death penalty that has lots of good information. And the single most significant factor in whether a person gets the death penalty, because it's interesting to point out that, of all the murders, less than 1% of the people get the death penalty. Why is that? Well, the single most important determinant is the race of the victim. If you're a black victim, it is least likely that the person who murders you will get the death penalty.
Next question.
We started out with Amy talking about we're being in a bleak situation. And there are two aspects of that I'd like to ask any of you to speak to if you feel like you'd like to. The first is, I think, as young Americans, mainly young Americans, very young Americans are dying every day in Iraq, and of course many more Iraqis. I think many Americans feel completely cut off from the young Americans who are over there. They volunteered. It's somebody else's problem. We're going around, the Red Sox are back in season, How do you understand this way in which we are, and of course media, I'm sure, play an important role in this, how we are cut off from the fact that today young Americans were killed in Iraq, Iraqis were killed, and if we're lucky, we'll get to wait till sometime in November to cast a vote in a swing state for John Kerry and hope that it'll make a difference. And the second part of this bleak situation is about that. I would ask Noam if you'd like to elaborate a little on what you see those small differences, and I'm not saying they don't exist, but what do you think are the small differences that can, given the scale, make a significant difference? And in this intervening time that we have where the killing will presumably continue, what else can we be doing other than wait until sometime in November to cast that vote?
Well, first of all, my own view, as you may or may not know, is that elections are relatively insignificant. aspect of what we ought to be doing. The propaganda system, including the media, tries to get you to focus, laser-like on the fact that once every 4 years you have a chance to vote for two very similar candidates from the business party. That's not the important form of political activism. If we want to stop being a failed state and become a democratic society, things are going to have to happen in between the 4-year period. You want to, take Haiti. Take Haiti, the poorest country in the hemisphere. How was Aristide elected? Aristide was elected because in the slums and the hills of Haiti, where most of the population lives, there was actually a lively, vibrant civil society organized with a lot of grassroots movements and other kinds of activism. And nobody was paying any attention to it because who pays attention to what those guys are doing? But to everyone's amazement, they succeeded in electing their own candidate. The U.S. had a candidate in that election, a World Bank official, who everyone assumed would sail through. He had all the capital and everything else. He got 14% of the vote. They succeeded in developing a democratic society that could elect someone of their own. We can't even imagine that. We can take lessons from Haiti about what democracy is. And it's not showing up every 4 years and saying, vote for me. That's not what democracy is. It's all the things that happen to build up a democratic culture where you can run your own candidates. And you don't have to choose between, two men born to great wealth and political influence who went to the same elite university and joined the same secret society and are financed by pretty much the same corporate sources that allow them to run. Then you'd get a democratic society. What are the differences? I think you know as well as I do. There are differences. The people around Bush happen to be at a very extreme end of a rather narrow spectrum. They're very dangerous internationally. They're not only the invasion of Iraq, but many other things. They're pressing for development of military programs, which probably may very well do us all in. Clinton was pushing them too, but not at this level. They've compelled the Russians to respond. Russia has roughly tripled its military expenditures since they came in, and developing new offensive military weapons as a perfectly predictable reaction to the vast escalation that they're carrying out. They're developing new kinds of nuclear weapons, what are called low-yield nuclear weapons, bunker busters, which sounds kind of nice until you read the technical literature and discover that both the Russian and the American strategic analysts agree that the point of the bunker busters is to destroy Russian command bunkers with nuclear weapons hidden inside mountains just like ours are, so that they'll be vulnerable to a direct attack. And they're responding exactly as everyone knew, by extending their offensive military weaponry, threatening us. China's going to do the same, and so on. That's extreme. Bush, like Clinton, might pursue similar programs, but nothing at this level. Domestically, there's a very substantial difference. If you look at tax programs, the social benefits programs, and so on, the people around Bush are making a very dedicated effort to dismantle and destroy the entire array of progressive legislation and achievements that's been reached in the last century. Okay, now the Bush-Clinton people aren't all that much different, but they don't have this visceral hatred for democracy and social welfare that you find in the Bush programs. But they're not going to push through a tax program like Bush's. Well, those are small differences, but they do translate into big effects.
I am going to have to make this the last question from the audience. I'm sorry.
This is for anyone who'd like to comment. Is the 9/11 Commission a step forward to you in giving the public more objective information, or is it a step backward into heightened partisan debate, or is it neither to you?
Well, there's something very interesting about the 9/11 Commission and about the Clark revelations and the O'Neill revelations and so on. And the interesting question is why anybody cares. I mean, why is anybody surprised to discover that the priority of the Bush administration was to invade Iraq and that terror was a much lower concern? I mean, we know that. If we were able to believe, to express, to think, if we were able to think what the majority of people in Baghdad express, if we could reach that level of, independence and intellectual culture, we'd see that it's obvious. Yeah, their main priority was to gain the first secure military bases and dependent client state right in the heart of the major oil-producing region in the world. And the question of terror was quite secondary in that respect. In fact, we don't have to argue about it. What was the invasion of Iraq about? I mean, they understood perfectly well that the invasion of Iraq was likely to increase the threat of terror, exactly as it has done. Every intelligence agency predicted this. Every strategic analyst did it. Yeah. And that demonstrates their priorities. The priority is to control dependent society and major military bases right at the heart of the oil-producing region. They've just demonstrated it by the invasion of Iraq. So what's the debate about? If we were allowed to think what sane people take for granted, we wouldn't even be paying attention to the 9/11 hearings.
I'm going to have to cut it off now. I would like to end with one question, please, for Professor Chomsky. In an interview a few years ago with the publication The Weekly Alibi, you said, and I quote, "You can do good things with the Internet. The question is whether it will still be possible to do good things after it falls totally into the hands of private power." I wondered whether you could comment on what you consider to be the current state of the Internet and the potential of news and information on that medium today.
Well, briefly, the Internet, like almost the entire economy, the whole new economy, was developed in the state sector. There's a dynamic state sector of the economy in the United States. That's where most innovation and creativity and development takes place. It's a perfect device because it socializes the risk, it socializes the cost, and if anything comes out, you hand it over to private power. That's called free enterprise. The Internet is a good example. It was in the state sector for about 30 years. It was handed over to private power around 1995 in some manner that nobody's been able to unearth yet. It was just done. And it's led to changes. In fact, media critic Norman Solomon did a study where he looked at the references to the Internet before and after the transfer to private power. And before the transfer, the main references to the Internet were information superhighway. After the transfer, it was e-commerce. Okay, that's one of the effects of transferring to private power a public creation. Now, ever since then, there's been a struggle, and it goes on, as to whether the Internet is going to be a free and open system or whether there will be ways to control it so as to divert people away from what they might be interested in and into the directions that the corporations that own it and fund it want them to go in. So if you look something up, you want to find something, I don't know, whatever it is, first you have to wade your way through a pile of ads that are coming and, don't go down the path they're trying to take you through and so on and so forth. These are all, that's part of the struggle. You know what you're looking for, you can still find it. But there are, of course, going to be efforts made to make it harder and harder. On the other hand, there's a struggle to keep it more and more open. And it's like other parts of the media. It's a terrain of struggle. How it turns out depends on what people like you do about it.
And speaking of the Internet, I hope you all sign up for the daily digest of Democracy Now! So you can get all the news alerts and headlines every day and the stories that we're working on.
With that, I'd like to say thank you, Amy Goodman, David Goodman, and Noam Chomsky.